Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the match review / match preview with me, Andrew Musgrove, and John Gibson. We're going to look ahead to the game against Sheffield United on Saturday at St James's Park in the second half of today's show. But first, we have to look back. We have to reflect on a disappointing night for Newcastle United versus Crystal Palace down at Selhurst Park. They lost 2-0, 2 goals from Mateta, in what has to be arguably the worst performance we've seen this season. And we've seen some stinkers, we have, but John, that was up there with the worst. Just sum up your feelings on last night's performance.
I mean, hugely disappointing because we'd got 10 points from the last 12. We were on a run. Europe was waving at us, across the channel. Here we are, come and get me. And the performance was timid. It was tepid. There was no courage, no belief shown. Attitude, which Newcastle United are rarely accused of having an attitude problem. But the attitude didn't seem right last night. There was a lot. They wanted it more than us, and they had less to play for because they were safe, really, which was their whole thing of the season, was to get safe, make certain after change of manager, etc., that they kept Premier League football. They were safe. We had everything to play for. We got the encouragement of Sheffield United, of all teams, being handed 2 goals and twice leading at Manchester United. If Newcastle had won and Sheffield had been able to hang on, it would have been a different ball game. But it was dreadfully disappointing. And, it's got to be said, Eddie Howe was given tremendous plaudits, hailed as a genius in some quarters, and I can understand why. In the way he tactically set up against Spurs, he decided to go exactly the same way because we'd won 4-0 down at Crystal Palace. It wasn't quite as simple as that, Andrew, in my opinion, because they're 2 very different teams that play a very different way. I mean, Spurs play with a high line, so going man for man, and then getting balls over the top, spinning and getting our quick guys away, worked against Spurs. Was it going to work against Crystal Palace, who were a totally different ball game? It worked with Murphy playing as a wing back against Spurs and Kraft on the right side of 3 centre-halves. I thought both of them struggled at Crystal Palace. They weren't alone, mind, not by any means alone, but that experiment with Murphy and with Kraft didn't work down there.
The formation is the big talking point on social media amongst fans, and I want to just touch on it now. You've obviously said how this set up. I can't sit here, John, and say when I saw the team news, when I saw the way they started the game, that I thought Eddie Howe had got it wrong. We discussed it on the match preview, and I raised with you whether he would stick with that setup, and he did do so. And having spoken to the Crystal Palace fan on the podcast before the game, and he said, look, we like to play it around at the back, that's what we like to do. Maybe Eddie Howe and his coaching staff and his scouting staff thought that was what was going to happen, that Palace would have more of the ball and Newcastle could set up in a similar way, and the game would run out similar to it did against Spurs. But what happened was Newcastle ended up having the majority of the ball, and I think that's what caught them out, and that was a really big flaw in the setup working. When you saw the team news drop, John, did you automatically think, this is not the right formation?
Well, without trying to be a clever clogs, because I wouldn't try to outthink Eddie Howe, he's the professional. But I had apprehension. I thought with hindsight, I thought it was brilliant to do it against Spurs because nobody saw that coming against Spurs, including probably Tottenham and Big Ange. But it worked brilliantly. I was a bit apprehensive this time because Palace are a different side. I wasn't expecting to do that, deep down inside, he tends to go with the same team if it's done the business, and you can't do it more than 4-0. But that was a big experiment. It worked tremendously. Will it work again? And it didn't. Maybe he went that way because he didn't want to tempt fate. Maybe he went that way because Lefremenko wasn't quite as fit as he ought to have been. It didn't work. And the interesting thing was, for me, is it not only did it not work defensively, but if you go on the other side, and we had talked famously in the podcast, let them fear us. We shouldn't fear them because we've got the front three we've got, and we've got midfielders that can hit them and get us to be ruthless on the counter-attack. Our front three never really looked the front three they can be, and that was awful. And they had the best two players on the park in Eze and Mateta that scored the 2 goals. I mean, they were the best 2 players on the park. I mean, Eze had better feet than Gordon, and Mateta looked a better finisher than Isak. I'm not talking about all time. I'm talking about on the night. Eze is a wonderful player. You know what I think? Thank goodness Ulysses wasn't fit enough to start as well, because and he's had injury problems this season, and therefore they were doing a bit of a cotton wool job with him. They don't want him to go down again and have a bad summer and not come back on all cylinders. So he was dropped to the bench. If he had played as well, they might have ripped us apart. Certainly, Eze looks an absolute quality player. And Mateta's scoring goals for fun. We'll talk about how many Isak's scoring. He's scoring since the new manager came. He's scoring a pile. And we didn't work, but we didn't work from front to back. I said last week when we beat Spurs 4-0, there was nobody who could say actually had a poor game in black and white. I honestly believe there's nobody who can say had an outstanding game in black and white at Palace.
Yeah, I think it's very hard though, John, for me to stick the boot in on Eddie Howe for starting that way when I canvassed for it beforehand. I think it was really good management from the Palace boss. He's probably looked at the Spurs game and thought, I think Newcastle set up in that way. Let's have a look at how it worked for them, why it worked for them. And it was because Spurs had more of the ball, Newcastle had less possession, and they just handled Spurs when they came into their own half and hit them on the counter. And as you said, they could pop the balls over the top. And he's probably looked at it and thought, okay, we want to be a possession team, but for this game, we don't want the majority of possession, and we'll nullify Newcastle's threat by letting them have more of the ball. And I do think Newcastle looked less comfortable on it when they did have it at the back. Now, the big question is whether Eddie Howe should have changed the formation maybe, during the first half, which is a rarity in most cases, but it does happen. Should he have changed it during the break and they come out with a different style and different formation? Very easy, John, to say that in hindsight, because Eddie Howe might argue, well, actually, at half-time, it's 0-0. Yes, we've been battered a little bit, but we're still level. If Isak doesn't take such a heavy touch when he's one-on-one with the goalkeeper, that goes in, we're 1-0 up. Everyone says, brilliant, the setup's working. Should he have changed it, though? Is the criticism that I've seen about his in-game management justified?
With hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, you would say, yes, it ought to have been changed because it clearly wasn't working. But no doubt it crossed Eddie's mind that when we were in London last at Fulham, this match was following a similar pattern. We got battered first half at Fulham, came out, things were different in the second half, and we won 1-0. And that's a rare victory away from home for Newcastle this particular season. And he was probably hoping exactly the same thing would happen again. To make that happen again, the team talk had to be good, and it had to be taken aboard by the players. Now, we don't know if the team talk was good or not. I suspect that it would be as good as it was at Fulham, but it wasn't taken aboard by the players. There's no question about that. And, what worried me as much as was the system, right? And the system was controversial, to go with it again, because he doesn't like 3 centre-halves. He's said that repeatedly during his time at Newcastle. He prefers a flat back 4. He doesn't like 3 centre-halves. He went with it with Spurs. It worked. He went with it again. It didn't work. But what bothers me as much as did we tactically get it wrong, and of course when you lose you have tactically got it wrong, was that what I saw was so frightening. We were very tepid. Our attitude was nowhere near what it should be. You wouldn't think we had anything to play for in that game. When we had Europe to play for, we didn't look as if we had anything to play for. I don't want to go overboard against a team that's taken 10 points out the last 12 because they've done terrifically and had a bad night at the office. That can happen. But it's often said by managers, it's not losing, it's the way you lose. And the way we lost was poor. We apart from being tactically found out, there was no spark in the side. We were tepid, we were timid. There was no belief. You would think we had nothing to play for. You would think Crystal Palace were going for 6 top, and we were just sitting in mid-table, not going to go down and not going to go up. And therefore, if they wanted so much, here you are, you can have it. It looked a reversal of roles completely, and that was worrying because we had an awful lot to play for. Because, believe you me, at the end of this season, and we're only 5 matches away from it, the season will be judged by what happens in the next 5. If we make Europe, with all the injuries we've had, and we've got to 2 quarterfinals of the domestic cups, people will say, that's good. It follows on from last season. We've had all these huge difficulties, but we've overcome them. We've got back in Europe. We've been in 2 quarterfinals of the FA Cup and the League Cup. We're okay. If we don't get into Europe, this will be judged a failure despite the injuries. So there's a huge amount resting on the last 6 games, which included last night. And I'm talking about from the players' point of view. Eddie knows that. The fans know that. The players have resurrected all hopes by getting 10 points out of 12 and then produce a performance like that. And I'll repeat, it's not that we've lost, it's the way we've lost that is very disturbing.
I think everything we criticised Spurs for lacking a few weeks back, lack of fight, lack of conviction, that's exactly what Newcastle were lacking against Crystal Palace. And there's so many questions to how we got to this point, how they put in a performance like that, 10-day break, for example, and we'll get onto that in a moment. And I just want to talk, though, about Eze, because you've mentioned him there, John, and we spoke about him in the preview podcast. The chap from Palace highlighted what a good player he was. And he said the one thing you cannot do is give Eze space. How much time did he have throughout the game? Now, in the first half, some will argue that they had a few shots that didn't really threaten. Okay, easy saves for Dubravka, fine. But there was one effort in particular that flashed just around the post, and it was a shot from Eze, and he had the time and space to do what he wanted, and there was a warning sign. The first half was a warning sign on what was to come. We've allowed Eze time and space to control the game, to move freely, to create chances for Palace, to have his own chances. Why on earth, in the 15 minutes Eddie Howe has had with the players, has he not said, someone get tight to him, rattle him, get a hard challenge on him, get on his back? Because the warning signs were there. And what happens 10 minutes after the interval? Mateta scores, and it comes from Eze being allowed just to do what he wants. The ball is from Eze, it goes into Mateta, to Ayew, back to Mateta. I mean, there's so much wrong with that goal, John, and we'll get into the other elements. But the first thing that stands out is how much time and space Eze is afforded. And I just can't get my head around it. You know how good he is. So why on earth are we not stopping him?
Well, you've got to delegate one man to look after him. Because if you don't, if you just say, look, let the nearest man pick him up, you're not going to be the midfielder, the defensive midfielder or the back 4 player that's going to pick him up because he's going to make a fool of you. You've got to be told it's your job to pick him up because he's going to make, if it's just the nearest man takes him, you make certain you're not the nearest man because his feet are so quick and his brain is so lightning sharp. He plays, we've said the Newcastle needed 10. When we were looking at whether we buy Maddison, whether we buy this guy, that guy, or the other guy, do we need a 10? This guy plays 10 magnificently. He's got wonderful, wonderful feet. They used to be all about Zaha, didn't they? And now, for me, at least he is terrific. Mateta will score goals, but Eze is the new Zaha for them, and more so. And we just didn't handle him. And of course, defensively, you don't want to be the man to have to man mark him because he can make a fool of the best of players. And he certainly looked the danger last night. And if you're centre forward like Mateta, by Jove, you're going to love playing with this guy, aren't you? And he's scoring a pile of goals in just on the night, because I'm advocating that I've got great belief in Isaac, Gordon and Bonds, and I'm not going to suddenly, after 90 minutes, decide that I haven't got belief in them. Not at all. Not at all. But on that 90 minutes, Eze outdid Gordon and Mateta outdid Isaac. So, you know, and we were worried about their front three. I talked about a gunfight at OK Corral, if you remember, when we thought Elise would play. And thank goodness he didn't play, because Elise, Eze and Mateta are some three, as ours are some three on a good day. And we didn't handle or get anywhere close to Eze. But the funny thing is, Andrew, we could go all over the park. You know, we didn't lose just because we didn't get a hold of Eze. That had an awful lot to do with it. We didn't lose because our two centre-halves got bullied by Mateta in the second half. We lost every battle all over the park. And the wounds were self-inflicted. And it was almost like, you know, I once saw Bruno fight Mike Tyson for the world title. And Bruno looked scared. Before he got in the ring, he looked scared. Well, we looked next to scared last night. We didn't look as if we were the dominant force. We should have been the Mike Tyson last night, because that we have the ability to be that. We certainly shouldn't get taken to the cleaners by this Crystal Palace side. Good though the front people are, because they're still, you know, you take a couple of players out of that side and they're an average Premier League side. That's why they're where they are on the league table. And we were last season a top four side. You couldn't have if you had just dropped in from outer space to watch this match and you were scouting for Arsenal, would you have took Isaac or Mateta? Would you have took Eze or Bonds or Gordon on the one display? I mean, we ought not to have allowed that to happen. And I don't want to get depressed. And on the second half of it, we'll be talking about Sheffield United. But, you know, this has got to be a blip. This has got to be a bad day at the office. This has got to be filed away in a drawer, locked with a key, and the key thrown away so that we don't see that performance again. We've got to learn from it, yes, and we've got to be ultra critical because it was awful. But having said that, it was 10 points out of 12 before that. So and we can't give up on Europe merely because we were awful last night. We've got to say Manchester United are still catchable. They're only 3 points ahead of us. We've still got to play them. And the way they've played in sacrificed situations against a championship side, Coventry, and against Sheffield United, in twice being behind the Sheffield United, that they are far from good. And they're more consistently poor than we are consistently poor. They are still catchable.
You see, John, I can't agree 100% with you there. I mean, not on the fact Man United are uncatchable. They totally are. And I still think Newcastle will probably beat them at Old Trafford. But hopefully by that point, they've got a few points on them anyway. But just about it being a blip, though, because we've sat here so many times, particularly after an away game, and highlighted the same issues that are always flagging up. Now, look, I said a few weeks ago, I've just come to accept Newcastle are going to be very inconsistent. They're going to concede goals. They're going to lose games on paper they shouldn't do. I've come to accept it, and we kind of do a root and branch survey in the summer when the season's over. Because, look, Newcastle's still in the fight for Europe. It's going to be a miracle if they get there, but what an achievement it would be. You know, but if we look at this game, if we look at their away form, John, there is a mentality issue, and it is the same issues that's rolling into their bad form. You know, the lack of conviction, the lack of fight, the lack of organisation. You mentioned about what you said pre-game. You know, don't fear them. From the word go, they looked like they were scared of them. And
that's what I said. Mike Tyson and Frank Bruno.
Yeah, and I would love to say this is a blip, but it's not. Their away form is a massive, massive issue.
Well, I mean, I've written in the report in the Chronicle, Andrew, that I've already filed. We aren't going to make Europe by how we play at home to Sheffield United and Brighton, we've got to take 6 points out of that. But that is not what is going to determine Europe. It's what we do when we go to Burnley, when we go to Manchester United, and when we go to Brentford. Because we have lost 10 out of 16 away this season. That is awful. That is horrendous. For a side going for Europe to lose 10 out of 16 of your away games in the Premier League, and we lost away last night, and 3 of our 5 remaining fixtures are away. And they will decide, not the 2 home games, because we can get 6 points at home from those 2 games. Indeed, we're only in with a chance of Europe because of our record at St James's Park. Yes, we might have had blips like Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest and Luton, but in the main, our record at St James's Park is what's got us in with a chance. Away from home, we struggled. We won the last one before we went to Palace, 1-0 at Fulham. But we were slaughtered in the first half then and got a result. So when we go away, Burnley's our next away game. Now, that's so winnable, it's untrue, under normal circumstances. We better not go there with the attitude we had last night. As much as tactics, as much as should Eddie have changed that midstream, and I think the tactics were wrong, and I think they ought to have been changed midstream. But as much as that is a problem, what else we are seeing in terms of being tepid, in terms of not going... I mean, come on, men or boys, stand up or not stand up. Take one on the whiskers, but give 2 back. And, we've got to do that. Now, we'll do that at home. We'll basically do that at home, but will we do it away often enough? And we've got to do it quick because there's only 3 away games to go. But those 3 will determine so much. I mean, really, we've got to be unbeaten in those 3. Whether there's a draw in there and whatever. But if we are going to make Europe, we need to be... I mean, you can argue we need not to lose in the next 5. But because we had our defeat down at Palace. Are we capable of doing that? Well, it's too late, as you said, it's too late now to try to right too many wrongs. The full meeting has got to take place this summer towards putting things right, etc., etc. It's got to be as much now about morale, about getting them in, about pumping belief into them, about pumping courage into them, about making certain they're organised, about appealing to their own self-esteem, etc., just to get us over the line. It is too near the end of the season to do a complete overhaul, a complete rethink, get on the training ground and sort things out. We haven't got time to do that. It's as much going to be the words that are said in the dressing room daily at training as it is tactically what to do on the field.
But just the fact that you've mentioned they've lost 10 away games this season suggests it's not a blip, is
10
it?
10 out of 16.
There's something fundamentally wrong with Newcastle United on the road. So it's not a blip, that game against Palace, and something needs to change. And as we've both said,
no,
it's not
I think the result wasn't a blip, Andrew, but what the result was too much par for the course, unfortunately. What concerns me was the manner of the defeat. That the great alarm bells, we can lose 2-0 at Crystal Palace if we'd fought like tigers and looked organised and got deprived of a penalty when Longstaff went down and would pepper their goal, etc., etc. We could look and say, come on, we're not going to be that unlucky again. We're lost. We've sacrificed 3 points, but let's go. We're going to be better. What worries me is from kickoff. When we kicked off, we had got 10 points out the last 12. We were playing a side which a couple of weeks back were in relegation trouble. Now had nothing to play for. We had everything to play for. We start front foot, we start compact, we'll go after them. We did none of that. That worries me the most, that we did none of it. And we emphasized in our podcast, let them be afraid of us, not us afraid of them. And I stick by that completely, and I think that's what was wrong. We were afraid of them.
Yeah, I totally agree. It showed, as you've said there, from the first moments. And I just want to go back to the rest of that first goal, because you said there Eze's got far too much space. But then what happens afterwards is slightly even more frustrating, because he's played it into Mateta. Shares dived in to try and get the ball. He's then left Mateta behind him. Ayew, who's 2 yards off the edge of the box, is free. No one's around him. Passes it straight back to Mateta, who's also now free. And it's schoolboy defending. And one of the worst goals I've seen Newcastle United concede in a very long time. And then the second goal, John, is equally nearly as bad. Sean Longstaff gives it away on the halfway line. Hughes is allowed just to sprint freely up the pitch. Bruno, looking like he can't really be bothered to get after him, keeps up with him, ball into the box. Hughes, again, free to do what he likes, goes into Mateta, back of the net. But there's so many elements wrong with both of those goals that it's unforgivable, actually. Criminal defending. And, I've seen people say, oh, they were well-worked goals. Okay, yeah. From a Crystal Palace point of view, you can say that. But from a Newcastle United point of view, from a defensive element, if you're Eddie Howe, you ought to be absolutely fizzing in the manner both those goals were conceded.
I think everything you've said there is right. Excuse me. And again, it's going to come down to almost Eddie becoming a tub thumper in the dressing room between now and the end of the season, because there isn't. If we are having to work things out on the training ground in terms of tactics, etc., is late in the stage of the season this is, then there's something mightily wrong. It's too late. We've got to go back to basics, try to get the basics right, and then the real debate privately with the coaches and with Eddie starts in the summer. We've got to get there, and the only way to get there is to try to rally the troops. Try to remember, tell them the basic things, and get back, I'm afraid, to the tried and trusted, which, basically speaking, becomes a 4-3-3, because he's played that most of the time. And,
But surely, John, we don't need to be sitting here and saying, get back to basics, I don't know, mark your man. I cannot tell you how infuriated I am at the manner of those 2 goals.
Oh, I can see it. But, I hope that Eddie's as infuriated as you are, because, but the one thing we can't do, Andrew, with only 5 games to go, is stack our hand and say it's all lost now, or we may as well have a fag and get out the paper and sit in the deck chair because we've got no hope. Etc., etc. We've got to try to make a silk purse out of ourselves here for the last 5 games, and then have a really serious look at what's wrong, and a look at personnel, and a savage look at personnel. How much does it want to change? How many people have been there a tad too long? A lot of the players are still around, and Eddie got huge credit for this, but they're still from the Steve Bruce era. He's got great credit for making them much better players than they were then, but they're still around. Do we need to make greater changes? Do we need to be more ruthless? How much can we make changes in the summer with the financial fair play? Or is it a matter we've got to be really bold and get a big hitter out, being very selective of who that big hitter is, by the way, and just to shake it up, because it needs to be shaken up. Do we want to start next season and see, and I'm not having to go at particular individuals and say it's their fault, but do we want to start next season and look at the bench and see Dummett sitting on it, and see Richie sitting on it, and see Kraft sitting on it, and what's the team then, and have we got enough about us to do it? Because they've they look well past the sell-by date. Now, they've got nothing to do necessarily with the defeat last night because they weren't around, but that's Kraft was on the park, certainly. But there is a huge review to be done, but it isn't. There isn't time to do, and there's no point in doing it now because we've got to operate for 5 games within the structure. I'm talking numerically. If what we've got, and yes, we've got the best game possible coming up for redemption. If you want redemption, please play Sheffield United. So you've got the perfect game coming up for redemption, but that will not. We can be all doom and gloom now because of what happened last night. And by the way, I can't hear the alarm bells. I'm not deaf. But we can be all doom and gloom with that. Then we can go and hit 5 against Sheffield United and think we're walking on water again. Neither is true. We should beat Sheffield United like that. It was terrible last night. The game that will determine so much is not Sheffield United at home, it's Burnley away.
Yeah,
how do we play away and how do we do with Burnley?
Well, that's it. It goes back to Newcastle's away form and the clear mentality issue that they've got away from St James's Park. And look, Eddie Howe is not a bad manager. Newcastle United aren't a bad side. I still think they will qualify for Europe, but I still think it's very important that you don't.
You do think they'll qualify for Europe?
I still think they'll qualify for Europe, whether it'll just be Conference League. I'm not against that. I think that would be a fantastic experience. But I equally think, as
with 3 away games out of 5, and you're worried about away form, you still think they'll make it?
I still think they'll make 7th.
7th.
Yeah, I'd like to think they beat Manchester United, but that's kind of a heart over head situation, given what happened last night. I mean, last night's performance has set me back a little bit in my confidence. I mean, I did say last week, 6th, get the passport out, but maybe I've been hit by a bit of a reality check, and I think that's the important thing, isn't it? Is that we both said there's not enough time to fundamentally change the way they play, tactics, formation, etc. But I think it's really important that doesn't result in just writing last night's performance off, because there's so much wrong with it that needs to be addressed. You've also mentioned there, John, about clearing players out, but it goes back to how much Newcastle are going to be able to spend this summer. Yes, Paul Dummett, Matt Ritchie, let them go. And I understand that the likes of Emil Kraft and Jacob Murphy have come in for a lot of criticism last night. They didn't have a good game by any stretch of the imagination. But Newcastle United are not going to be able to ship out 8 to 10 players in the summer. And even if they do, they're not going to get that much money in for them anyway. So it's not exactly going to push up the bank balance. I think people need to be just a little bit realistic in what they're asking for in the summer in terms of a clear out. But in terms of last night's performance, John, I just want to read you a couple of stats. So Newcastle had 53% possession to Palace's 47. Newcastle played 503 passes to Palace's 441. But this is the key stat. The accurate passes, Palace had 336 accurate passes from the 4-4-1. Newcastle had 337, so just one more in the entirety of the game, which shows you that it was all about being clinical with the ball. And Newcastle just give the ball away far too often when they did manage to have it. And that's a concern, that they're not careful with it. And if they're not careful with it against, with all due respect, an average side like Palace, can you imagine what happens when they play a good side?
Oh, that's correct. But they're not going to play a good side for the rest of this season. They might play a better side than them, because you can say Palace were a better side than them last night. But they're not going to meet a quality side. When we look upwards from our position in the table, we're not going to play any of those that are above us.
But do those stats worry you?
The season, or Manchester United, who went above us last night. But
those stats, do they worry you, John? Because it is a sign, isn't it, that especially away from home, they're not careful enough in possession, and that's a key fundamental part of the game. Of
course, they worry me. But then again, you can bring that all down to attitude, can't you? the attitude's not sharp. It's not positive. Else they would be careful with the ball. They would be quicker to the ball. They would have more urgency about them. I think the biggest problem for Eddie between the final whistle last night and the whistle that starts the game on Saturday afternoon is getting into them mentally. I think the biggest work he's got to do is when they're all sitting around in the dressing room at the training ground and he's standing in the middle of them and he's talking to them. That's as important as what he does on the training ground, because he's not going to do anything revolutionary on the training ground again. We had that great tweak against Spurs, which we tried to carry on with and infinitely didn't work. A, different opposition, and B, one was at home and one was away, and that is hugely different. He has got to get into them and either repair the attitude, which might be cajoling them, or telling them a few home truths they don't want to hear and sort bullying them and say, you're all playing. If anybody's comfortable in here, please, about next season and about where you stand in this club, please put your hand up, because I want to know, because you will not be here next season if you're comfortable, mind, at this stage, because we need you to be driving on the way you did last season. And the bulk of the team is the same team as last season. Yes, we've had injuries, but I'm talking about attitude. We've complimented these players and said the great thing they have is camaraderie, togetherness, and they're good on attitude. We've said in the past, we're not going to fault them on attitude. We maybe can fault them on tactics or slightly on ability, some of the individuals, but not on attitude. Well, I thought last night we could fault them on attitude.
I agree. Yeah, the attitude wasn't there, and it's not often we've said that about Newcastle United. Even in their darkest moments this season, we've always at least had the right application, but it just was not there. As we said from the word go, Palace wanted it more. I mean, Eddie Howe's pinpointed the first 2 minutes went very well for Newcastle United, which has got a few chuckles from the fan base. But after that, it was just awful. And the 10-day break Newcastle United had, John, we spoke about this at length in the preview podcast, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And we kind of settled somewhere in between. We would have liked to have had the momentum coming off the Spurs game, but at the same time, 10-day break should allow the players to come back refreshed, revitalised, and they still should have that buzz from that Spurs game. They should have been up for last night. Now, Eddie Howe said, I thought we looked a little bit rusty. After 10 days, look, you can be disorganised, you can lack fight, you can just be poor. But one thing you should not be after 10 days is rusty. You should be full of energy about the pitch.
Andrew, you can't have your cake and eat it. Managers, Eddie included, but all managers want their cake and eat it. If we're not hearing about they're playing far too often and the poor souls are tired and they're exhausted and this ought not to be allowed, which is why we've got rid of FA Cup replays, because they're far too exhausted. Now we're told effectively they've had far too long a break and they're all rusty. Now give me strength. You can't have it both ways. You can't have it where we're playing far too much football and they're all exhausted, and no wonder they get so many injuries because they're playing relentlessly 3 games a week. And then you get a nice little break and all of a sudden you're rusty because you've had the break. You can't have your cake and eat it. It's either one or the other. And you know what it is? It's the word that's tattooed right across the forehead. Excuses. Managers, and I'm generalizing, I'm not talking about Eddie in particular, managers need and want in their second nature as excuses. Oh, we've had too long with inactivity. Oh, we've had far too long of too many games. The exact opposite, but both get blamed for results.
But it's another element, another thing that needs to be put on the list for this root and branch kind of look at this season, isn't it? Because this is not the first time this has happened when they've had the break. And then they've come back and they've looked even more tired than they did before the break. Like, what is going on for this to happen? Because there's no way they should have looked as depleted as they did last night after 10 days off.
No way whatsoever. But how can you get rusty in 10 days? I mean, even if you stand out in the rain all night, you're not going to be rusty, are you? I mean, it's with respect to Eddie, that is a nonsense. The way it's often overplayed. Oh, well, we've had a play Saturday, midweek, and Saturday. Far too much football. Pep goes on about it. Eddie always makes a point. I don't want to make that an excuse, and good for him, but it's always pointed out. I mean, there's people that say, don't get into Europe unless it's a Champions League because you're going to have to play on a Thursday and it's all going to be too much and you're going to be exhausted. Well, perhaps the exhaustion will mean we're not rusty.
Yeah. Yeah. I say 10 days off. Obviously, there was a couple of days off, then they were in training. Goodness knows what was going on, because whatever they worked on definitely did not show up against Crystal Palace. There was the penalty shout, John. Not a penalty for me. Not a penalty for me. I mean, Sean Longstaff should stay on his feet and take the shot. And time again, when he's in that position, he just goes down. Look, there's contact. We've seen them given. But I don't want to see those kind of penalties given. Very soft. And he should stay on his feet and take the shot.
Yeah, I follow that thought completely. I mean, Bulldog centre forwards, Shearer, Supermac, Haaland, Aguero, don't go down like a stack of cards the minute the wind blows, looking or hoping for a penalty. It's a modern trend. But the reason I haven't brought it up so far and really dwelt on it is I don't want to provide excuses for last night's result. I don't want to hide behind, if we'd got a penalty when Sean Longstaff was brought down, it could have been a whole different ball game. That would be hiding away from the facts, because the facts were, penalty or not, we were poor and we got what we deserved for being that poor. And we can't afford, in the 5 games left, to be anywhere near that poor again, or Europe does disappear.
No, I agree 100%. And it's interesting that we mentioned Sean Longstaff. He's coming for a lot of criticism from some fans. He's playing through the pain barrier. I look at someone like Adam Wharton in the Crystal Palace midfield, who was bought from Blackburn in the summer, and he looked fantastic yesterday. We've mentioned Eze. I mean, even Will Hughes looked like a Champions League player, thanks to Newcastle's poor performance yesterday. But on Adam Wharton in particular, Newcastle United, they need someone like that in the middle to play alongside Bruno, don't they?
Yes, if you do that consistently. And I must say he has, since he's moved from Blackburn to Palace, which is terrific. The midfield, it's all up for discussion at a different time, but you're going to have Anderson, you're going to have Miley, you're going to have Tonali, you're going to have Bruno, you're going to have Joe Linton. There's going to be an awful lot more options. We still need a certain midfielder, but with all those, somebody then's got to be sacrificed, haven't it? Because when they're all available, we've got a £52 million midfielder we've never really seen yet in Tonali. Where's he going to fit into this side next season? And who goes out from 52 million? That's not chicken feed. That should be a superstar. I mean, Wharton was what, 20 million?
Something like that. No, I mean, the options.
You're supposed to be 2.5. In theory, you're supposed to be 2.5 times better if you're Tonali at price for price. So we've got to see what Tonali produces, because having had a wonderful debut against Aston Villa on the opening day of the season, I'm still waiting to see exactly what we've got here. And forget about the ban and it's thinking of the player and what he does. That's something, but that is spending big bucks, and that's got to be justified. As £28 million has to be justified by Hall, of course.
Well, this is going to be my next question. And did he get the personnel wrong last night, Eddie Howe? Even if you're going to set up the way he did, do you bring Lewis Hall in to play as that left wing back? I mean, in the end, the way Palace were pressing Newcastle, it turned into a flat back 5 anyway. But Anderson not really looking at home. He was brilliant against Spurs in that role, but lots of questions to whether Lewis Hall should have started. Tino Livramento is not fit, according to Eddie Howe, so they don't want to be risking him. But on Lewis Hall, when he came on, John, he was probably the spark, really, amongst quite a dark performance.
Yeah, I mean, if I was picking the side for Saturday, I would go back to a flat back four. I would play Livramento if he was available, but on what Eddie's saying after the game, it looks as if he doesn't want to. I mean, it's contradictory. I'm not certain what Eddie was saying. He's saying he's fit enough to play, but in some ways he isn't, and it would be a risk. Now, what exactly that means, I don't know. He's either fit enough to play or he's not. And if he's on the bench, it should be because he can come on and influence the game, but he's not brought on. Well, he may as well not have been on the bench. If I could, I would go back to a flat back four of Livramento, Shaw, Byrne and Hall on Saturday. I don't think you need any fancy tactics against Sheffield United because they're Sheffield United. That would then leave either Barnes or Murphy to get the wing position up top. If you haven't got Livramento, you've got to play either Kraft there or go with Murphy there in a flat back four because you think you don't need too many defenders because it's Sheffield United. But, you know, I would certainly start Hall on Saturday. And if at all possible, start Livramento because I think he's a quality young man. And if he's not fit, what's happening? Because we don't know. And Eddie's quotes were just confusing. He is physically fit, but it would be a risk to play him. Well, what sort of risk? Do you mean because you've had injuries so often bringing players back in the past, like Joe Willock and like Bachman, that you don't want to do it again? I'm not certain, not fully explained. But certainly I would start Hall and play a flat back four with Byrne tucked inside with Shaw.
I mean, Livramento came on against Tottenham, didn't he? So unless something kind of has happened in between those two games that we're not aware of, and Eddie Howe will no doubt again be quizzed about it in his press conference on Friday. I mean, the other big question, John, is what on earth's happened to Kieran Trippier, because he was in the squad for that West Ham game. He was there in his tracksuit. Then he wasn't on the bench, and then we've not seen anything of him. And he's a big miss, you know, alongside Joe Linton. You can tell.
Yeah, and are we going to see Joe Linton or Pope before the end of the season? Because
I think we'll see Joe Linton.
Close.
I think we'll see Joe Linton. The start of the month, start of May. I think we'll see Joe Linton for the last couple of games. Kieran Trippier, not too sure of. I mean, I'd play Emil Kraft on Saturday. I don't think he'll risk Livramento, so it'll be Emil Kraft for me. The midfield.
No, he's already opening the door to not using him.
Yeah.
By the quotes that he come out with after the game.
I mean, the midfield will be the same. Bruno Longstaff and Elliot Anderson. I mean, Sean, he needs to come out of the side, but he just hasn't got the options to change him. You're not going to start Joe.
There's not options there. There's not options there.
And I suppose Joe Linton coming back is probably going to be the best thing for Sean, because then he can be taken out of the side for Big Joe and be given that rest and taken away from the criticism that he's getting. And then up top, you've got Anthony Gordon, Harvey Barnes, and Isak. Although, to be fair, John, I wouldn't be surprised actually if Murphy started ahead of Barnes on Saturday. I think Barnes.
That's why I put him in. Is it going to be Murphy or is it going to be Barnes? Because he loves Murphy. Yeah. I mean, he loves him so much he'll play him right back just to get him in the side. But I'm not going to go against what I said before the game last night. And I said, in my humble opinion, and it doesn't count for anything because only Eddie Howe does, but the three best attackers we've got are Gordon, Barnes, and Isak. And you've got to shoehorn them into the side. And I know two of them like playing on the left side, Gordon and Barnes. Although Barnes can play on the right side and just come in the other way onto the other foot. But they're the three best we've got. Barnes was poor last night. But if you throw everybody out that was poor last night, you can't feel the team on Saturday because 9/10 of them were poor. And I'm not going to change my opinion that I think Barnes is a better player than Murphy. I think Murphy is essential to Newcastle as a bench player coming off the bench. You've got to have a strong bench, and he's good and he's willing, etc., etc., etc. But I don't think he's better than Barnes. But I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, he loves him so much. he'll play him right back, right wing back, or on the wing. You know,
Up top
Murphy.
too. He's played up top, John. Don't forget that. He's played him up top as
Oh,
well.
I mean, I think the only position he wouldn't be considered for is goal, and I'm not so certain about that. So he's always going to be in the mix. But we haven't got onto it last night because there's been so much steam coming out of your. You haven't got onto it yet because there's so much steam coming out of your ears about last night, and I can understand why, and so many Geordies as well. But all I say, and I mentioned it early on, is that if you need redemption, if you've belly flopped off the high dive board in one of the most disappointing performances, awful performances of the season, then you can't wish for better than facing Sheffield United next, because they are awful. Let's consider before you leap in with the theory of you never know what's round the corner. Let's consider exactly what Sheffield United are. They're rock bottom of the table. They've won 3 games out of 34. They've conceded more goals than any other team in the division, 92, which is worse than Derby County, who had previously the worst record in the Premier League. 92, and they've still got 4 games to go. So they're rock bottom, 3 wins out of 34, most goals conceded, least scored, 33, and that even includes the 2 that were gifted last night. Bottom of the table, relegated in theory weeks ago. In practice, mathematically, it never happens, but they're down. They have conceded 4, 5, and 6s all season. And we've stressed that we are poor away from home. We've lost 10 out of 16. We won 8-0 at Sheffield United. That's how bad they are. We, with 10 defeats out of 16, won 8-0 at Sheffield United. I mean, they are awful. There's no question. And if you need redemption, bear in mind we are better at home than away. Most sides are, but that's why we've got a chance of Europe. If you've had a game like last night, what do you want next? Please, may I have Sheffield United?
I'm just going to utter the phrase famous last words, that, John. Because now
That's
you've said
right.
it.
I tell you what, I'll tell you something, Andrew. If you or Eddie Howe or Newcastle United fans or anybody in that team that had the wrong attitude last night thinks we can't beat Sheffield United, they shouldn't be in the club. They shouldn't be supporting Newcastle United. And there's something dreadfully wrong. Europe, what you said to me a little while back, quarter of an hour back, you still think we'll make Europe. Should we be worried about Sheffield United? And famous last words, that should be the match where we, by the way, if we beat Sheffield United 6-0, I won't automatically think that means we're back and we're back in Europe, because we've beaten a bunch of easy beats. What will determine it's the 3 away games still to come. But if we don't beat Sheffield United, we may as well pack it in for the rest of the season and put the under-18s out.
No, look, we will beat Sheffield United. We should beat Sheffield United. I'm being slightly jovial with the phrase of famous last words, but there's always something in the back of my head when you expect Newcastle United to do the right thing, to do the given thing. There's always that little banana peel that they end up slipping on. But goodness me, they
Sheffield
shouldn't
United's
lose, and they can't lose.
Skin. They're not the banana skin; they're the banana. I mean, you can't lose to Sheffield United. If we lose to Sheffield United or draw with Sheffield United, then we the last few games we've got to play, we may as well stack our hand, because we really have no chance. We'll beat Sheffield United, but that doesn't guarantee Europe at all.
Yeah, and look, back at home, the home form was brilliant, and we saw against Tottenham when everyone is together, the arena's a difficult place for a good side like Spurs, let alone the worst side in the Premier League like Sheffield United. So they should beat them. They can't afford to lose to them, because then the reaction will just be quite something. What are you predicting, John? Are you predicting a win? Of course you're predicting a win.
Yes, I'm predicting when I use the word comfortable, I'm not meaning that we're comfortable for an hour and a half. I mean the eventual scoreline, which could be anything. I mean, they've been letting 4, 5s and 6s in all season. I mean, they have let 92 goals in 34 games, for goodness sake. I mean, that is not a colander. That is a bucket with the bottom bashed out of it. It just rains goals whenever they play. They're playing Manchester United, who have just let in 3 against Coventry in 20 minutes. They're gifted a 1-0 lead and a 2-1 lead. And how did they end up? They let in 4 goals as usual. Again, against the Manchester United, absolutely panicking, the crowd biting their nails and getting all stroppy and everybody wondering when the manager gets a sack and all that. And they still get done by 4 against a jittery old side like Manchester United. I mean, they're awful, Sheffield. They are awful. I mean, let me reiterate, we've lost 10 out of 16 away. We won 8-0 there. And by the way, that wasn't a fluke one-off. They let 4, 5 and 6s in at home and away regularly. They are the walking dead of the Premier League. And, you know, if we didn't beat them, Hereford had more chance when they come up here in the FA Cup. And they got a draw up here and beat us away. They have more chance because they've got a greater attitude in will and desire. They're fragile, bless them, Sheffield United. I've got nothing against them as a club. They're a lovely club. The manager cares passionately about the club because it's his club, etc., etc. But bottom line, Newcastle win this match comfortably, or we can all go home.
And I'm going to back them to win as well. As you say, we can't think about anything other than a Newcastle United victory on Saturday. 3 o'clock kickoff. You can follow it live through our dedicated match day live blog over on chroniclelive.co.uk. You can also catch Eddie Howe's press conference on Friday morning. For myself and John, it's been a pleasure as always. Please leave us a rating and review on the podcast channel. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up. And we'll see you guys next week.